Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of the Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Karen Tucker, CEO of the Churchill Club. Welcome. Our program tonight is called Building Trust in 2013. And I would like to start by acknowledging and thanking our program sponsor and partner. It is Edelman Public Relations, a longtime member of the Churchill Club, and our two organizations have worked on many programs together over the years. For this program, both the San Francisco and the Silicon Valley offices worked with us, and we really enjoyed working with the amazing people at Edelman. Thank you very much, Edelman, for making this program possible. Edelman has just released the findings from its 13th annual Trust Barometer. This year, their study includes input from 31,000 people in 26 markets around the world. This is the largest sampling to date. It measures trust in institutions, industries, and leaders. And for us, this important work has given us insight into the most up-to-the-minute way to frame this year's discussion around the important issue of trust. We are privileged to have with us four distinguished speakers, not only for their professional and academic leadership, but also their thought leadership and the insights that they contribute in the interest of economic growth and innovation. And they are Eric Channing Brown, GM of Integrated Communications at Skype, Mary Dent, General Counsel for Silicon Valley Bank, Richard Edelman, CEO of Edelman, and Jeffrey Pfeffer, Professor of Organizational Behavior at Stanford University's Graduate Business School, and of course, our moderator, Peter Burrows of Bloomberg Businessweek. Thank you all very much for being here as well. A brief introduction for our new guests in the audience. Churchill Club is Silicon Valley's premier independent business and technology forum and has been convening unique Silicon Valley-style gatherings since 1985. And what drives us every day is to encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And we do this through the up to 40 programs that we convene each year where like minds can connect with ideas and with one another. We are a member-supported nonprofit organization, and if you are interested in joining us, we would welcome you to be part of the organization. If you are tweeting, please use the hashtags Churchill Club and Edelman PR, and you'll find other Twitter codes in your printed programs. So let me now introduce our conversation leader who will ask our speakers to self-introduce. Peter Burrows is a respected senior writer for Bloomberg Businessweek, based in San Francisco, and he has covered the high-tech industry since, I believe, around 1989. And he has covered Apple, Cisco, Microsoft, and a broad range of markets, companies, and people and trends. He's also the author of an acclaimed book called Backfire, Carly Fiorina's high-stakes battle for the soul of Hewlett-Packard. We look forward to the conversation that he will lead for us tonight. Please give your warmest welcome to Peter Burrows.
Thanks very much, Karen. Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and I'm really pleased to be here with all these wonderful panelists. You know, I thought I probably shouldn't name drop right at the start, but I have had the privilege of covering Apple for many years, including covering Steve Jobs. And I remember many occasions where I'd call him, there would be some story blowing up. Maybe it was, why is my iPod getting scratches on the screen, or I'm offended by the name of the iPad for, I don't know if you remember that controversy. But, and he'd always say, trust us. Why haven't we earned your trust yet? You know, and I always thought, well, that's kind of a cop-out. And yet, clearly, it's what happened. I mean, Apple somehow, some way, managed to earn the trust of millions and millions of consumers, now the second most valuable company in the world, I guess. So anyway, it's just been a fascinating topic to try and figure out what is it that really creates trust. Why don't we start with the self-introductions? Eric?
Great. Eric Brown. I'm the GM of Integrated Communications at Skype. I've been in Silicon Valley doing PR and comms and employee engagement for over 20 years, and my first actual real press meeting when I was young and those things were rare was with Peter. I don't even remember the company I represented at the time, but I was incredibly intimidated to be going in front of Businessweek and Peter Burroughs. So it's very strange and kind of full circle to be sitting here to his left. So
I'm so old that I forget.
I can't even remember the client, but it's great to be here, so thank you.
Hi, my name's Mary Dent. I'm with Silicon Valley Bank. I try and hide the fact that I'm a lawyer who works for a bank. So I'll skim right past the general counsel job, and I do two other things that are really fun. I do R&D for the bank and also policy work on behalf of startups and helping Washington understand why they live here. And in a particularly relevant thing, I've spent the last 6 months with my team really working on trust and how do you build trust and what gets in the way of trust. And it's been a real focus of mine personally, so I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, I'm Richard Edelman. I run the global PR firm, and my clients in the room include HP and Adobe. And also I want to mention that I've spent a lot of the last year working on Penn State, speaking of trust. A lot.
I'm Jeffrey Pfeffer. I teach at Stanford Business School, where I've actually taught since 1979. When you arrive at heaven, you do not leave. I teach an elective class on power and organizations, and over the years have written and continue to write. I used to write for Business 2.0, but I outlasted them, and so now I write occasionally for Bloomberg, Businessweek, and Inc., and a bunch of other blogs.
All right, well, obviously the foundation for the conversation tonight is the Trust Barometer study. So, Richard, why don't you talk about the highlights of this year's survey and give us a sense of what's changed.
Okay, so we do this study every year. It's the 13th year, 26 countries. We do general population as well as so-called informed elites. The informed elites are the top 25% of income, 3+ media a day, and college plus educated. So we have 13 years of data for the informed elites and 2 years of data for general population. So a couple of important findings. One, trust is incredibly fragile. So last year, for instance, Japan went from, say, 10th out of 26 to 25th out of 26 because of Fukushima. And so trust is fragile also as evidenced by a drop in the United States between November and January. We decided to go right after the election, and figuring that there might be euphoria after the election to see what it looked like in January. The drop in trust in government was very profound, as you might expect, because of the fiscal cliff and whatnot, but there was an actually equal drop in trust in business in that period, and it was all in general population. The elites said, no problem. The general population said, Jesus, this is bad. Trust in government is at 30% in the United States among Gen Pop, and that's terrible. That's the lowest level we've seen, ever. But the trust in business is not that much better. It's 10 points higher. So, whereas elites are 20 points different. There's 20 points difference between the elites and the mass in the United States. There's no country that we look at where the gap is so large. So I think this is an important area for us to talk about. So, fragility of trust and also the gap between general population and elites. Second key point. We observed that the technology industry is the most trusted industry of any around the world, and that's consistent in every one of the 26 markets. Financial services is the worst. That's not why you're here, but since you are here.
Tar and feathers comes
No,
later.
no, I'm not doing that. Just the data can do it itself. Banks are bad and getting worse. In fact, 2/3 of the people we survey around the world think that the corruption evident in banking is spreading to other industries, that the anchor effect on trust from banking is really serious. And again, this is another topic that we should discuss. And it has to do with the culture of bonuses and the sense of sort of, good for the shareholders and good for the employees, lousy for society. The business model issue for banks. The third thing I want to talk about is the evident crisis of leadership. You see that trust in institutions seems to be recovering and coming up, but trust in leaders is not. So what we saw in 2008 is that CEOs and government leaders both were seen as ineffective and not performing. Experts, professors, raise your right, sir, and technical experts, very high, but also person like yourself, peers, employees. They trust 2x more than a CEO for information about a company and a regular employee. So that's a vote of non-confidence in traditional leadership. And also, when asked the question, do you feel that a business or government leader can answer truthfully a difficult, complex question? The answer is only 18% for business and 13% for government. That's sad. That's a crisis. Fourth key point, the change in values. It used to be that a company was trusted based on its operations. In other words, if you had a great new product stream, if you had a highly ranked CEO and you made the numbers. Everyone said, oh, that's a great company. That's what it was before 2008, before General Motors and Royal Bank of Scotland and AIG and Citigroup, and I could keep going in the list of bankruptcies. But what's happened now is that people start to trust a company based on more qualitative factors. So, do you treat employees well? Are you transparent about your operations? Are you actually performing in a so-called shared value context? In other words, good for society and good for shareholders. And those are the aspects that bring you trust. At a 2-to-1 rate over the so-called operational, which is simply table stakes. So our strong view is that the world has changed, that it used to be this so classic pyramid of influence that all of us studied in government class, where communications was vertical, went from top down, there was general belief in the leaders, and that no longer exists on its own. It's now got a corresponding inverted pyramid of community. And these are activists, these are employees, these are also your key customers, your consumers, and they're speaking horizontally. So it's at the intersection of vertical and horizontal, and it also, in our mind, calls for a different form of leadership. It used to be that the leader would lead on the basis of position. So I'm Jack Welch, I'm CEO of GE, trust me. Well, guess what? CEOs of big companies, people go, I don't trust you. And so who do I trust? Somebody else. It's got to be inclusive management, and therefore you talk to the employees first and Wall Street second, not the other way around. So that's it.
Yeah, I think one of the most striking things was about the gap in leadership and
Yep.
how much lower the trust was in business leaders versus businesses. Why do you think that is? And is it based on reality? I'm wondering, is there any evidence that there really is a business ethics culture problem such that that's deserved?
How about the former CEO of Yahoo? How about Beaujolais in China? How about Bob Diamond, CEO of Barclays, whose bank was cheating people on LIBOR? How about Lance Armstrong? I could keep going. I mean, you have disappointment after disappointment this past year. How about Rajat Gupta, Mr. Superstar Davos, 3 years ago, being led away in chains for insider information that he passed to a hedge fund that he had a big interest in after the Goldman Sachs board meeting. I mean, these are things that people, actually 65% of the people we surveyed said they had heard of scandals in financial markets this year. They're not blind, they're reading what they're reading, and they draw their own conclusions. They think that business is good, but they think the leaders are corrupt, that leaders are liars.
How much of it, there's been a lot of talk about the demonification of business this year in the election, from the political sector, even though they did even more poorly in your barometer. How much do you think that matters? I mean, do any of you have any feelings about whether that's had a real impact on your businesses or what you see in business?
I think there is something very interesting about the belief that small businesses or medium-sized businesses are somehow the engines of American growth and what that means. And there's an intimacy to those companies. But if you look at, and certainly there's a huge volume of them, but if you look at the population of Americans employed by big business, if you look at the benefits packages and the salaries and the just everything that big businesses provide, they really are bigger employers and better employers. And we as a society seem to mythologize the small business and give them and ascribe to the small business attributes that I think we don't give to the big corporations, even though they are the innovation engines to a large extent, and they're fueling American wealth, progress in social services, progress in society in terms of the types of benefits they offer, whether it's maternity leave, paternity leave, LGBT benefits, all of that stuff driven by big business. And so yes, I think the American corporation gets a very bad rap.
I guess I'd also say, I mean, they're part of the equation, and I think that, anytime you try and classify an entire group of individuals or organizations as good or bad, I mean, you're going to miss something, and for all, I completely agree that the headline stories have been really disheartening over and over again, the betrayal of trust. That's a very small number of all the companies, and I think when you think about our ability as a society to move past the problems we've got now, the fiscal situation, things like that, that when you demonize somebody, you basically make it impossible to have a discussion on the facts about what's the right way to move forward. And so I completely understand and have a lot of empathy for people who judge corporations for moving jobs offshore. But I don't think it moves the conversation forward to say that they're wrong, because they do it for a reason that ties back to our financial markets and our legal system and the duties of corporations. And I think when you can't get past demonizing people to say what makes them choose to do that, where could America be strong in manufacturing, how can we adopt different policies, improve our education or whatever to reclaim jobs or create new jobs that make sense, then you're stuck. And then you just get this sort of back and forth about who's good and who's bad, as opposed to which decisions and policies and actions can move us forward rather than leave us stalled.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the trust plays into it, right? I mean, if you don't have the trust, then are you really going to be able to make an effective argument for some of these policies? It seems to me people have been talking about SOX and the implications that has for years. And there's lots of policy issues that I don't feel like the tech sector has really made a lot of headway with. It's almost like, I guess I just wonder if you disagree, if anybody disagrees and thinks that we do have, if there are good spokesmen out there, or what we need to do to make a better case, I guess.
Well, I would suggest that the first thing people ought to do is tell the truth. So my friend Gary Lubman, when he became CEO of Harrah's, or COO first, was a very strange situation because he had been a Harvard Business School professor and was hired at COO directly with no managerial experience. And I guess because of his professorial background, when he came into Harrah's, he said, I determined right then that we would build a culture in which basically we would have no lying. And lying means that you do not knowingly say something which at the moment you say it, you know not to be true. And there's actually tons of examples. Jimmy Kane, Dick Feld saying that their balance sheets were in good shape when they knew they weren't. People, I could give you quotes, which I brought with me, which I won't, from Silicon Boys, talk about Larry Ellison. And so they asked one of the co-founders of Oracle, does Larry Ellison lie? And they said, well, Larry Ellison doesn't lie, but he has a problem with tenses. In the sense that, the idea that we have this product may mean that we will have it in a few months, or, we're thinking about designing it or whatever. And it's interesting, as I, said to my friend here, it's interesting that there's such high trust in technology. It is actually out of the high technology from which the term vaporware comes. And the concept of vaporware is obviously selling a software product that has not yet been designed. And also the other famous concept of reality distortion field, which is another one. So my recommendation, so Gary, who's, by the way, will tell you is no Methodist minister, which you can't be in the casino industry, said, basically we are going to build a culture in which people tell the truth. And he carries this even to an extreme. So they fired an assistant manager of a casino who went home and killed himself. which happens. Everything happens at Harris. They've had hurricanes and everything. And the PR people, or his internal people, wanted to put out a statement saying so-and-so died as a result of an accident. And he refused. He said, you don't have to say he died. You don't have to put out a statement at all. Or you could just say he died. But he said to say that he died as a result of an accident when you know that is not true. And people said, Gary, come on, get over it. And he said no. He said, we're on a slippery slope. As soon as I begin to let you say somebody died as a result of an accident, then we move down this slope. But he will tell you, and he will say this much more strongly than me if he were here, that American business leaders make the Russian Historical Society look like mere amateurs, and that there is just enormous amounts of lying going on. And so the first and most actionable recommendation I would suggest is that people need to the extent, which doesn't mean you're not going to say everything, because people are going to make mistakes and situations change, but you ought to, at least that the words come out of your mouth ought to be the truth.
For me, the big change for business has to be to move beyond this idea of license to operate. I don't know how many times you've heard the idea, we have to earn license to operate. To me, that's an entirely legalistic format, and it doesn't give you sufficient area in which to make any mistake. So, suggestion, business, move away from the guardrail, start to operate in a so-called radically transparent way, and have a higher aspiration, which is license to lead. That, in fact, if government is discredited, business has an opportunity, but business done the old way of license to operate, which means you basically listen to your general counsel and do everything up to the exact edge of the law so that you don't get hurt, means that you could actually slide across the line too easily. And you have people, Kathy knows some of them from her times in Wall Street, Lehman Brothers traders, they will go right to the edge and a little over. And it's not allowed anymore because you have such skepticism now about all institutions. Somebody has to actually see, hear, or read a story 3 to 5 times in different media in order to believe it. That's just indicative of this lack of confidence. So if that's the case, then behave better. It's like you've been caught out and you stayed out too late and you're the teenager and you've done bad things, and so you have to re-earn trust. Do it differently.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me that in the boardroom, a communications or marketing person frequently does not have the same voice as the finance person or the general counsel. And so what we've veered towards is protecting ourselves in courts of law as opposed to protecting ourselves in courts of public opinion. And in terms of trust and in terms of long-term reputation, I would rather have $1 million lawsuit. The GCs I work with would hate to hear that, but $1 million lawsuit to me is cheaper than losing a lot of reputation. And comms people, marketing people, customer advocates need to be really forceful about that, to say our reputation is worth more than a lawsuit. Settle out of court because the long-term cost of the brand is going to be much higher than whatever you went through in a jury or out of court.
And the other thing...
The GC's disagreeing. She's looking
No,
very
no,
skeptical.
no. It's fascinating because this kind of conversation never comes up. One, I would say that people are often 2 or 3 steps ahead of me in thinking through what's the right thing to do. And I think we do hold ourselves to a very high standard. 2, I think there's this mythology that you have to get close to that line for shareholders. I think companies get the shareholders they deserve. And I think if you build a reputation of trust and that you're here for the long run, then you get shareholders who buy into that story and you can actually shift. And that's one thing that companies, I think, let themselves get caught in a cycle where they're solving for the wrong thing because they don't realize that it's not a monolithic shareholder base, right? Different shareholders have different time horizons, different expectations. And our former CEO sort of famously back in the bust, 2002, refused to do any cuts in the employees, right? And he just said, this is a cycle, we're gonna get through it, we're gonna need those people when we get through it, and I'm not gonna throw them out. And he was very clear with our shareholders. And a lot of people thought that was a dangerous move, and it wasn't, because again, it tends to drive your shareholder base to the kind of people who value honesty and integrity, and I see it play out all the time. So I think, to me, with all due respect, the mistake is believing that within a management team, within a company, there are these different positional differences, and that your general counsel has any less commitment to honesty and integrity and the brand in the best sense than anyone else on the team, or any more responsibility for ethics or anything, which some lawyers tend to wrap themselves up as I'm the conscience of the organization. I think people need to all be responsible for that. And when they disagree, they should talk about what's right, as opposed to believing positionally you should end up in different places.
I actually agree with you on that. I think for me, the issue is that comms, marketing, and customer advocacy groups are not as good in the language of risk assessment as lawyers and financial types. And I think until we start to talk about reputation as a risk management issue, then we're not having an equal seat at the table with that type of voice and that type of analysis.
But there's another issue, and that is, and I think your position illustrates it very well, Silicon Valley Bank is a great institution and is not at all like Royal Bank and all these other banks that are mostly going to have executives that are going to go to jail or something. But the problem is, and I think your data shows this very clearly, we are all tarred with the same brush. Right. And so reputations are contagious, and what sometimes befuddles me, and I'm not easily befuddled, or maybe I am now, what befuddles me is that when people in an industry act badly in ways that damage the reputation, because there are huge externalities, and not only just in financial services, but in every industry, there are huge externalities when companies and individuals within companies violate trust and do all kinds of bad things. It extends even to the innocent bystanders. What interests me is that there are relatively few sanctions for the bad actors. So the New York Times ran 2 wonderful articles on what happened to the people on the boards of directors of these financial institutions that everybody agreed, anybody would agree, behave badly. And the answer is essentially nothing. There's a wonderful quote in the New York Times about, they asked Alcoa how they could put Stan O'Neill, who basically drove Merrill Lynch into the ground, on its board. And they said, well, we wanted an expert on financial crises. And there is, there is a logic. Get somebody who caused one, and then, then they may be an expert on it. But if you look at the industry conferences, Jimmy Kane, Angelo Mozillo, Dick Feld, all these people, Martha Stewart, who actually went to jail, there's almost no social sanction. And because businesses do not really sanction the wrongdoing that goes on in their community, they then suffer, oftentimes if they are truly innocent, but everybody gets tarred with the same brush.
Well, I wonder if to what extent trust does show up in stock price. It's wonderful to talk about doing the right thing, but I can think a lot of companies that, barring a major disaster, even look at the bank stocks. They've had a pretty good year. They're doing fine. So how do you fight that? How do you fight that pressure you were talking about to not be beholden to you and the GCs and the folks who are really watching that bottom line and just staying out of trouble?
I guess I'd say what happened with financial stocks shows that people have much more choice than they realize, that they can, if you do the right thing, actually there's a huge amount of value creation in there. And I do think markets will reward it. It takes time and it takes consistency, and you're right, it can disappear very, very quickly. But I think this myth that somehow investors don't figure out who tells the truth. Of course, they're going to make some bad decisions, and some people are going to get away with it. But that's true in 3rd grade as well, right? Some people get away with bad stuff, and if we all say I'm going to behave at the worst edges because somebody got away with it, then that's a crazy way to live. So why not hold yourself to the standards? Why not use the fact that the public markets seem to be somewhat undiscerning and choose to use that space to do the right thing rather than engage in sort of the least common denominator behavior?
I think one of the most dangerous things that CEOs can assume is that trust is like putting little coins in your piggy bank, and that you build up this stock and that somehow you can take them out one at a time. Because what happens is it actually is a completely non-linear exercise. It is a geometric drop, and it is not a one-for-one kind of trade. And also, if you establish a certain level of expectation for your corporation and you don't behave that way, people 2x you or 5x you and say, oh, that's really terrible. One other quick thought for you. Jeff Sonnenfeld, professor at Yale, wrote a really important piece. It's another business school, not as good as yours.
But he's actually a good friend. I wrote a case on him.
Oh, okay, good. But I just want to just quote one thing from him. He said, prominence, positional leadership doesn't help you win anymore. You build legitimacy by showing humility. You also have to share your reasoning as a CEO. You have to reveal how you're going to get to some place by candid explanation and then proof. And I think those are all new thoughts for CEOs. They assume that they say it and it is so, and it is not so. Sorry.
So tactically then, if you're trying to sort of build I'd be interested to hear more about this platform you're trying to create and you as well. You're trying to develop a process for getting the reputation you think you deserve and the trust you. What's the role of the CEO? I mean, do you just have to really push that down the list of the ways in which you're going to try to communicate your corporation's message?
Yeah, for me, it's really a matter of audience. And I think CEOs play very well on Wall Street. I think CEOs can play very well in the developer community. If you need an ecosystem, they can play well in a channel environment where you need VARs, resellers, integrators to get your product to the market. Very powerful there. If you're a consumer brand, and I've represented a couple of those at this point, I think CEOs are frequently the worst ambassadors for your product. You want other users, you want actual advocates, you want people who are passionate about your product. We were just talking about how her son stays connected with her family via Skype while he's away in college in Boston. And it's that type of advocacy and passion that we can tap into through social mechanisms today that we did not used to have at our disposal as brand builders or reputation keepers even 5 years ago. And so I think it really starts with who is your audience and what do you want from them. But the options for engaging consumers and building your brand with them are just limitless today. And CEOs, I think, are the worst spokespeople for that particular audience.
I guess I'd say also that communications is about the person on the other side of the communication. So our business is very different from Skype. It's largely a relationship-based, much more one-to-one. We work mostly with companies, not consumers. But I think it starts with thinking, well, who am I trying to talk to and what's relevant to them? And so what person can I put in front of them that's going to help them get out of the conversation what they're hoping to get at? And when you think about it from their perspective and help connect them to the person who's most relevant to them, rather than thinking about sort of who am I pushing out, then I think you start to unlock where people can be effective because you're not thinking about yourself, you're thinking about what you're trying to deliver to somebody else that they need or want from you.
But ultimately, that means that those of us in the communications business have to persuade the CEO that lack of control is actually less risky than the loss of credibility inherent in controlled messaging. Because if it seems Stalinist, it is Stalinist. And that just will not work, And let the community, I know Adobe it does this really well with, put the beta out, let the Facebook folks say, oh, we love this, we hate this, and you're very open about it, and you change the product, and then you go with it. But that's a completely different model than a couple of years ago, right? You're much more open to change publicly.
And I think the CEO obviously also sets the culture and the tone.
Yep.
So, it was interesting to hear you talk about the qualities of the new CEO. I'm sure that those are the desirable qualities, but when I look at the process by which CEOs get selected,
how interesting.
And the traits that will permit them to rise to the top, it is almost if we are selecting for exactly the opposite of what you have described. And then when you get people into that role, what the most important thing that CEOs do is they architect the culture of the organization. What are our values? What are we going to tolerate? And it starts really with them as role models. So you can't say we're going to have an ethical culture if I'm going to behave unethically. And that includes, what you do with various of your subordinates and, and your expense accounts and all kinds of other stuff, which also, unfortunately, is famous in the Silicon Valley. So, I think the most important role of the CEO is to serve as a role model and to set a set of standards which they are willing to enforce. So the question is, what happens when you find subordinates who don't tell you the truth? And what do you do, by the way, with subordinates who tell you the truth and the truth is bad news? My favorite scene, which I show at the start of my class, is is, Jack Nicholson from A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth.
Yeah.
Right.
And unfortunately, in many organizations, that's true. People can't handle the truth, and they particularly can't handle the truth if it's bad news. So if people tell, I've screwed up, or, we've made a mistake, or we're not going to hit our numbers, and the answer is you're fired, that will be the last time the CEO hears any bad news. It'll also be the last time probably the CEO hears the truth.
Another constituency is obviously employees, and there's a lot of discussion about the changing nature of the employee, especially out here in a very information worker kind of industry. Is trust a lot more important in terms of getting and keeping people than in the past? Richard, I wonder if the research shows anything there.
I think that the expectations of the employee force, we don't have exact data to that effect, but what I can tell you is that the work I do with my clients absolutely indicates a much higher bar, what people need to know, how often they need to be communicated with. If there are problems, speak up, tell us where we're going. Even if there are layoffs, you've got to say, here's the vision, and then here's the points of measurement on the way, because the trust me thing just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think the trust me thing doesn't work. I do agree CEOs are incredibly powerful for setting the vision, the tone, the ethics of an organization. One thing that I think CEOs of a certain generation still believe is that information cascades work and create engagement. And there are still practitioners who think that a message can come out from the head office and just somehow magically reach 10,000, 12,000, 20,000 other people, and it doesn't. And I think that the best organizations that tap into trust and reputation know that influence can come from anywhere, even the mailroom, and that everybody, thanks to social tools like Yammer or even Facebook, which a lot of companies use for external engagement of their internal employee base, are incredibly powerful. So tapping into that and making sure that executives, managers, individual contributors at all levels are part of an integrated conversation that has some sort of organizational flow and cohesion is really important. But those days of the CEO's office has the answer are long gone.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is, we judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their actions. And I think that even if you've got a CEO with the right intentions, if they're not working very hard all the time to explain to people the facts, to explain to people their motivations, then you will have people all over an organization inferring whatever they can from what they see, which by definition is going to be a small subset of what's actually going on, and may ascribe all kinds of things to behaviors that they don't understand. And so the work, I think the mistake is thinking that if you're a trustworthy person, then people will trust you, as opposed to realizing the amount of time and energy it takes to communicate to people in a way that gives them the information and the context that you can then let them loose, because you've built a culture, you can trust them to do the right thing, and you don't need to have a command and control kind of structure because you're all bought into a common vision. It's an enormously time-consuming process.
We've also, I think, spent time tonight talking about, in a sense, the demand side. We should talk about the supply side. I mean, Peter, you are clearly in part of a very fast evolving media business where a lot of the establishment media are under terrific business model pressure. And the number of classic establishment media outlets is shrinking. So I think, and Tom Ferensky and I talked about this very briefly, but every one of the companies here has to become a media company over time. They're not going to necessarily rival you in credibility or depth or analysis, but they have to have their own voice out there, just on the basis of shrinking space. And without it, you're going to miss the opportunity to be part of the social conversation. People are looking for information. They're going to find it somewhere. If it's the water cooler, that's one way. To be your own media company is another.
I wonder if we can kind of do a round of what are some of the most effective ways to do that. I mean, you've had a lot of experience, Eric, at Yahoo and Pandora and now Skype. What are the effective channels out there for companies to get their own message out?
We at Skype actually have run our last campaign from Skype with Love exclusively on media that we ourselves own. We have done a little bit of traditional media work and outreach, but we've seen amazing results in terms of user pickup and user traction just from media and channels that we own ourselves, which means that we don't have to have a message pull-through or syndication challenge. We control the message. We don't have to pay for it like we would advertising space. And we get to engage on our own platforms and our own forums in a very authentic way with our users. And so I think more companies will be moving towards owned media as important to them, especially when so many people under the age of 25 are getting their traditional media consumed through Facebook or Twitter or Vine or wherever, and it's disaggregated from the masthead and the journalist's name and the reputation that companies have built at Businessweek or Bloomberg or Fortune or Forbes. I think that what we put out is good enough and unfiltered, which makes it better.
Don't listen to any of that. It's not true.
But I think if you have subject-specific information, if you're Walmart, for instance, and you have a lot of information on supply chain, clearly you're going to critique they do or they don't, follow what they say they're going to do. But they're having put out, or HP having put out last week, your new standard for what you are going to do in terms of supply chain and no child labor, and you're going to have your own investigators. That's all perfect stuff for an HP.com piece of information. And they should put it out, and then you can critique it. But that's theirs to do, seems to
What
me.
about image advertising, traditional, good old-fashioned advertising? Do you see that as being as effective for the reputation of the company?
Well, naturally, I would say not.
Actually,
It must be somewhat effective. They paid $133,000 a second for the Super Bowl ad, so.
Yeah,
So somebody certainly believes it works.
I think the real power is in integrating all the marketing levers together. Because as Richard said, it takes so many impressions to create a message or an image or a voice. And advertising is a way to do it. Social is a way to do it. Blogs are a way to do it. Traditional media is a way to do it. And I think you need every single lever working in concert together at the same time, around the same theme, to really make the most of any one of those. So I remember 20 years ago, people would say, does buying space in publication X give you better editorial access? I would say absolutely not. But a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal is exposure that the journalists in the journal will read and see, and that is something that's worth having. And I do think traditional advertising, digital, online, out of home, TV, in concert with other programs is still very effective.
The thing that I think many companies are missing is the importance of their employees. So, there are all these websites where disgruntled employees can go on and talk, and disgruntled employees are a very bad ambassador for your organization. And so a lot of the companies that have worried a lot about their user community have not worried as much as they should about their employee community and what those employees are saying and doing. And so a lot of this goes back to how you treat and communicate with your employees so that they do not become your worst ambassador, but rather your best. I see lots of agreement from.
Absolutely.
Well, it is interesting as a journalist. I mean, I'm always asking, companies for your voice of the workforce data. They say everything's fine. Well, show us your data on how employees are feeling about the future of the company, et cetera. You never get that. I've never had a mediocre or negative report. Is that the kind of thing companies should be willing to share?
I think that if you have a baseline and you can say, okay, here's where we're going, and show progress, yes, I think it is something they should show. I think it's as important as supply chain data. And I just want to say one other thing about advertising. It used to be sort of like the lollipop, like the candy here and the stick, advertising and everything else. Now you could argue that it should be not at the beginning, it should be at the end, because it's the exclamation point. It's the proof that, in fact, the conversation's gotten to the point where it should have support from paid.
So would anybody want to go out on a limb and talk about companies that you think are doing a particularly good job, or I'm sure you won't bite on a particularly bad job, but a particularly good job of building their reputation and being particularly innovative?
So I'll take a shot. I think Meg Whitman at HP actually has taken this reputation challenge on in a very head-on way. I think she's been straight about what the expectation can and should be. I think she has proof points, and I think when things are going badly, autonomy, she comes out and says, we got ripped off, we're going after the guy, this is it. And I think the employees are starting to follow her. And I think that's a big change from the 3 previous CEOs.
All right.
Okay, I'm in Silicon Valley, we should have some reaction
No,
here.
I actually look to the consumer brands more for companies who I think get their brand and position incredibly smart. And I think about Target in particular. Such a loved brand, iconic, interesting, fun. They have a social ethos and that they give back to local schools, which makes them a local company. At the same time, they're national. Their advertising, their internal communications, their PR are all in complete synergy and sync. And so when I think outside of Silicon Valley, of a company who really just has a stellar brand and nurtures it and cultivates it in a smart way, for me, it's absolutely Target.
Well, let's see, you were talking about the fact that you have been working on this trust initiative. Just tell us about what the situation was that caused you to, how that came to be and what it is.
Well, this was not rehearsed, actually. It was our employee engagement survey, and in the words of one of my colleagues, my scores really sucked. So, and it got to, and this was really hard for me, right? Because I'm a good person. I really care about the people I work with. And to really confront what are the things that I do that do destroy trust, like all the time, even though I don't mean to do them. A lot of it was moving too fast. So I was volatile and inaccessible, and they never knew what they were going to get. I didn't think as much as I needed to figure out when am I going to let them go off and do something and make myself really think through what are the limits, where don't I want them to go. So I think they were feeling a little bit like they were never quite sure where they were supposed to sort of take initiative and go off and do something when they were supposed to come back with me. And communication. I think that I was sloppy in my communication and really thinking about what information did they need to know to make them effective. And I think all of those 3 things, and there's a whole lot longer list of all the deficiencies I have. I'm very good at confronting my own weaknesses. But we've talked a lot about it, and we took some specific steps in meeting in different ways, in talking explicitly about trust. We use the Stephen Covey book, which I really like. It talks about trust as 4 different aspects. It's your integrity, your intentions, your capabilities, and your results. And really trying to talk about where, for each of us, where does that start to break down and what can we do differently to start to build trust. And it gets back to that point that trust is not something that you get by being a good person. It really takes a lot of work to figure out what does the other person need from you and how do you come through for them in a way that is predictable and they know they can rely on you and they know what they can get from you and how to go about getting it from you, whether that's information or support for a decision they've made or support when they have bad news. And so we've been working on this for about 7 or 8 months.
Do you try to measure? Is there a metric that you can?
Well, the next employee engagement survey is coming up pretty soon, and I put in a couple of questions. One question specifically that I added for my team is, do you feel that we've taken specific concrete actions in response to the employee engagement survey results of the past? Because I really want to know. I mean, we talked about the results. They all know what the results were. For what it's worth, all the lawyers say, oh, don't worry, we're just lawyers. We always score everything really bad. Everything's fine. But so, yeah, it's been a very interesting conversation and a very interesting thing for me to think about with all the best of intentions. What do I do that is really harmful to the people that I care about and that I work with?
One of the things that I've read about recently in a book about how to deal with crises, which every organization is going to have, which I think many organizations today are not following at all, is get out ahead of the story and don't let your denials become an incentive for people to uncover all the ways in which you're lying. And I can give you a couple of examples. I think Walmart, with its supply chain, I don't think did a particularly good job, mostly because it turns out there were lots of emails and lots of evidence that suggests that they weren't quite as concerned about fire in the factories and the sourcing of their stuff as they claimed they were. And I think probably the worst example is Standard & Poor's, which I think is just encourage people.
Our clients.
That's okay.
No, no, keep going.
Yeah. So sooner or later, all these emails, or Julian Assange or somebody is going to release all of all the transcripts will be out there, and the S&Ps and their claims that they're innocent about this stuff or whatever. So I think you need to have a position that is defensible by the data, including every piece of data you think won't get disclosed because it will. And so this kind of dribbling out, well, we're going to admit that we did this a little bit bad. Oh, well, you showed we went over that line. Well, we didn't, and we went this thing, and it makes the story becomes then your, what's the line about, crime? It's never the crime, it's the cover-up. Mm-hmm. And I think that is just as true in image and reputation as it is in criminal defense. I mean, after all, if you think about it, Martha Stewart did not go to jail for the insider trading. She went to jail for lying about the insider trading. And Al Capone never went to jail, for all the things he did. He went to jail for lying on his tax return. So there is an issue, I think, in which many companies have not done a very good job of basically saying, okay, all this stuff is going to come out. Let's get ahead of it and get it behind us and come clean, as opposed to letting this stuff dribble out and thereby keeping it in the news for years.
But there's Apple would be an interesting counter to that, because, I mean, I've seen just in covering these companies, Apple they would just hunker down, and it could be the issue of Steve Jobs' health, or backdating, or there were a whole bunch of stories where they just kind of hunkered down, didn't comment for a long time. Greenpeace was after them for many years, and they just ignored it. And my sense is that a lot more companies are following that to some degree. I know just in terms of, at least in terms of their access, they're working with the press. They just, for whatever reason, maybe there's trust issues with the media, that they don't think they're going to get a fair shake. So I wonder, you don't think that Apple is doing a best practice here by taking just exactly the opposite approach?
I think they are, actually. I saw Yvonne. Where's Yvonne? Yvonne was with me at Yahoo. I don't think Carol Bartz would mind my saying this. I actually did an analysis, looked at 200 American media sources, broadcast, online, print, and compared Carol Bartz's reputation to Steve Ballmer, Steve Jobs, the Google horde, Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, and actually looked at all that coverage over a 6-month window, how they were treated and what the coverage came from. And we actually found that the executives who were more public and more out there and did more interviews were treated far more harshly than the executives who were not in the public eye. And so I think there is this, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but there is a bias towards let's print something bad and salacious and scandalous, as opposed to highlighting best practices. And all the outlets that covered the best practices, who used to do it in such a good way, just no longer exist. And the data that we did in that analysis with a third party was the more Carol spoke, the deeper the hole became, and the worse her reputation. And so then we decided no more speaking, and reputation went up almost instantly, or at least it neutralized.
Oh, really? It wasn't the F-bombs.
Well, I mean, again, in a speech of 2 hours, one F-bomb from Carol isn't so bad. Brilliant woman, amazing CEO. But there's what the media don't cover, which is why I'm such a fan of owned media or social media, is everything else that happened. That TechCrunch F-bomb was the F-bomb heard around the world. What people didn't mention was that on stage, Michael Arrington started his remarks to Carol with, "How the F are you?" And so, I mean, there's the narrative that media control is very scary, and the power you guys have when you get executive access is very scary. And when data shows that an executive who doesn't speak is treated more fairly, or when an executive is brought out as something to worship, like I think Apple's PR machine did with Steve Jobs, they are treated referentially, whereas the everyday commodity is treated like an everyday commodity.
But Apple's such a special case. I mean, I think you'd have to agree that the sort of Stonewall works because the good news overwhelmed whatever was in the sort of negative mind. We have the iPad. We have this constant news machine. And in a normal company, you just don't have that much good news. And you don't have Steve. And I think all of a sudden we're seeing the change in Apple now. Foxconn and all this stuff wouldn't have happened necessarily with Steve. He would have figured something out, I think.
And the other way, I think you're completely correct that Apple's an exception. One of the ways in which it's an exception is I have friends who work at Apple, and I will tell you it is an organization which keeps its employees, I don't know how they do it, from talking at a level that I've never seen in any other organization. So if you can keep your employees from saying anything to anybody about anything, then you can run the Apple strategy. But if you don't, then you get this dribs and drabs and the water on the rock and what's the bad news going to come out, and then one person talks and then the next person talks. So I agree completely that Apple is really an exceptional case.
I also would argue that Carol Bartz is an exception, just for argument's sake, that she had a reputation coming in, and that was a pretty hardened reputation, and you were kind of trying to push this stone up a hill, given her persona. And she's a terrific executive, but the persona was established. So you have to deal with that too.
Yes, that is fair.
Okay.
And that's what I'd say is that these things don't take place in a moment in time. They take place in a broader context.
In a
and
life.
It's you can't measure it by what happens at that moment that you do or don't say something. It really is, do you have a relationship? Do people trust you? Do they tend to believe what you say? Are they looking for the story? And why is that going on? I also do want to come back to the employee engagement survey. SVB actually has great employee engagement survey scores. We were one of the Forbes 10 best place to work. So I don't want to leave the wrong impression. My colleagues are wonderful at this stuff. I'm on the learning curve, but I'm unique in the organization on that.
Okay, well, I think we're about out of time and we're going to go to Q&A. So there's one in front.
Did anybody read today's Forbes?
Let's see, here we go. I guess we'll be bringing, raise your hand and we'll bring a mic.
Hi, Jerry Corbett here. I was wondering if anybody read today's Forbes. Let me read one sentence. It says, Mr. Immelt is the exemplary Teflon-coated executive, equally comfortable in corporate boardrooms and the corridors of Congress. This is a piece that came out today which sort of excoriates Immelt for his flip-flop about manufacturing. And I'm just kind of curious what the group's take on GE is in terms of reputation and trust. And I think you would have had to read the article, but I find it pretty interesting.
I think Jeff Immelt's done a great job of reputation management. I think he's been, for instance, on this GE Works campaign and the return to manufacturing by GE, I think that it's ahead of trend as opposed to lagging trend, and they take risk in that. But I think it's all to the advantage of the corporate reputation.
Next question.
Right, Mike. So let me paint a picture if I get this right. So people trust people like them. So that inherently creates a bad loop because bad leaders are going to trust bad leaders, right? So what happens is major information from people beneath bad leaders doesn't get trusted. That's how you have things like security breaches that don't get told to CEOs, they don't believe it. The head of the Super Bowl is told lights are going to go out, and he says, no thanks, we're cool, lights go out. So what happens is there's huge catastrophe. Richard's called in to clean up the mess. I think you also, a couple of years ago, you were asked to help clean up for Burroughs, too, for Fox, right? Huge catastrophe. Richard's called in. It would take 20 of you to clean that up, so I don't really blame you for that one. So point being, it takes huge catastrophe for change to really get enacted. And all of a sudden, we all kind of hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and care about the earth, and do all the supply chain stuff that you mentioned before. I promise there's a point here. So kind of two questions. Number one, how do you get CEOs to actually listen down so that whether they're good leaders or bad leaders, their lieutenants get information that's actually gets through and we can head these catastrophes off? And number two, what catastrophe do we have to endure to actually get real shared value change to happen from top to bottom? Because as the data shows, this is not just corporations, this happens too, it's government as well. And what's going to happen is it's going to take some massive catastrophe for everyone to go, oh, wow, this isn't working. And I'm not sure we can really sustain that.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think number one, the definition of catastrophe is ludicrous today. The lights going out in the Super Bowl, nobody died. Give me a break. That's not a catastrophe. It extended the Super Bowl. Advertisers got more time. People talked about it. I would say lights going out, even here tonight, not a catastrophe, a glitch, a problem. So our societal notions of what catastrophe means have just become as hyperbolic as everything else in American society, where you don't any longer do a good job, you do an awesome job. And so that's ridiculous. The second thing is we don't talk about all the catastrophes that are averted. And so every day in corporate America, there are catastrophes that are averted in terms of service outages or ethics violations. And it's kind of like the only terrorist attack that matters is the one that kills people. But every day, the CIA, the Secret Service, whatever, are protecting us. And that happens every day in American business as well. So I think I have a different perspective on some of that. And I don't think catastrophes happen that often. I think the checks and balances I see in business are happening on a daily basis towards progress over time. Nobody else is going to take that one.
I'm for the government, and I'm here to help. I'm probably the only public sector guy in the room. I'm David Vosbrink from the city of San Jose.
Brownie, you're doing a hell of a job.
We certainly are.
It's a bad line, sorry.
But actually, that's the problem. There are 10,000 units of government in this country or more, and we have a tremendous crisis of trust in government. We have a paradox. The more transparent we are, the more we tell the truth, the less people believe in us and trust in us, because we are required to tell the truth. We are required to share every document, every piece of fact. How do we build trust when people are predisposed to judge us by the incompetence of Bell, governors of Illinois, and we're doing a terrific job here in San Jose?
I can tell you from Penn State, which has a similar issue because it's a public university, that the first remedy was to have the free report, which looked at all of the governance issues, laid out 119 recommendations. Penn State said, here they are, and here are our goals for meeting them. And then every quarter we have a board meeting, and they say, and here's what we've done, and here are some issues that are outstanding, and they're judged by their accomplishments, as opposed to by the politics of the given day. And I think that's a very important part of it. And I think also technology is a critical part of this, in that actually on the cleanup of snow or any other, you've got to monitor progress and say, here's the problems and here's what we're doing. Because otherwise you're actually governed by the least common denominator. Bloomberg actually learned a huge lesson from this in New York, the snow 2 winters ago, when, the city said one thing, and then in fact the people on the street said quite another, or Fukushima, the same thing, when the mainstream reporters were saying, everything is fine, and good old Fukushima, and people were tweeting, no, we're frying, it's not good. Big problem.
I think governments also need to know their charter. I will give you huge props for San Jose, an amazingly well-run city. I don't live there. I live in San Francisco, which is quite the opposite. When governments think it's their charter to do 20 small things instead of one big thing, I think that's where they fail. In San Francisco now, the city council voted to outlaw public nudity and does nothing about the homelessness. I would care much more to have the homeless issue solved than to have everybody wear clothing in San Francisco.
Send the nudists. Send the nudists to New York.
Okay, yes.
They'll freeze.
They'll freeze. But Bloomberg did the same thing there with the big gulps. I mean, what a stupid thing for the mayor of America's biggest city to get involved in. And that just makes you think, if he has enough time to worry about big gulps and fat people, what is he not spending time on? San Jose does not do that. Thank you.
Okay, no more mentions of Bloomberg. Rule 1. Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Shayna Perlman from Skype, and I was really struck by something that Richard said right at the beginning of the program, in that there was an extraordinary difference in trust in government and other institutions between the elites and the general population. And I'm going to speculate wildly and assume that's because they're having a very different experience. And for a lot of us who are speaking not only with elites, but the general population, what is this going to mean for the future of communication if we've got to speak to both populations and their experience begins to diverge and diverge ever more wildly?
Can I give you one statistic that will make you scared? Do you know that 1 in 4 people in America who just have a high school education read no media on any given day? I think that this gap is partly indicating almost a nihilism and a sense of complete rage about, feeling as if they're cycling downward, that they can't make enough money, that they're really frustrated by the economic system, that they feel that government was representing hope after 2008 and failed them badly. I think they're feeling screwed, honestly. There's a sort of populist strain. And when we see those kind of gaps, you usually see some kind of volcano in terms of election stuff. And if I were, this is not a political thing, but whoever's incumbent in Congress, I'd feel very nervous if we go into this sequester thing and the economy goes backward and whatnot. I think there's going to be a lot of blaming. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
I agree with the first part of it up until the congressmen need to worry. I mean, the evidence on the re-election of incumbent congressmen, I mean, they've drawn the districts now so that nobody can get thrown out of office.
Yeah, the other thing I was just going to add is there is really interesting work about how people live in much more isolated communities compared to a generation ago, and we don't have common media. We don't all watch the same TV shows. We don't all look at the same news broadcasts. So we don't share facts. We don't share perceptions of reality, and I think it's a huge problem because if you go back to what I said before, we judge other people by their behaviors and ourselves by our intentions. It means that if you can't bridge that divide and communicate why are things happening in a way that makes sense to people across these different pieces, geographic, socioeconomic, whatever, in our society, then the capacity to actually talk to one another will just completely disappear. And then we'll be in a really bad place because people will feel screwed and there will be no way as a political or social system to get past that. And so I think it's a huge, huge issue.
And I would also say that the politicians, in many instances, have as bad a view or as bad ability to tell the truth as many business leaders. If you follow it, and if you can look at it on the Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, who both had a field day with this. In 2011, there was, as part of the budget negotiations, there was an attempt, which was actually, I think, largely successful, to take funding out for Planned Parenthood. And during that time, Senator John Kyle of Arizona stood up on the floor of the Senate and said, you shouldn't fund, I can read his direct quote if you want, but I can give you the basic gist of it. He said, you shouldn't fund Planned Parenthood because they spend 90% of their money on abortion. Now, it turns out the facts are that they spend 3% of their money on abortion or abortion-related services. And when this was revealed to Senator Kyle, his office put out a statement that said, and I will read this because I brought this. He said, release a statement, second part, the senator's remark was not intended to be a factual statement. Now, of course, you can picture Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, they had a field day with this, and so if you want, you can see the segment. But I think this fundamental disregard for any, here's the guy, 90%, he knew it wasn't right. When confronted with it was 3%, he'd say, well, it was never really intended to be a factual statement. That casualness with the truth is, I think, more than reprehensible. But had Senator Kyle not retired, I am sure he would have been reelected. Because people, I guess his constituents don't care. The sad joke is, how do you tell if a politician, or maybe in many cases now a CEO, is lying? Their lips are moving. And that needs to, of course, to be changed. But as long as we have people who will say whatever You know, I mean, and you can see this, again, not to pick on my friends, you know, a large percentage of the American public still believe that Barack Obama is not a U.S. citizen. And 25% of the U.S. population doesn't believe in evolution. But holding that aside, they don't believe, even though he released his birth certificate, that they don't believe, you know, the Barack, and that's because people are still saying that Barack Obama was actually not born in Hawaii.
Yeah, hello here. My name is Vinay Iyer. I'm the CEO and founder of a Silicon Valley startup called Gumball. I have a question, and probably more for Eric. The impact of acquisitions on trust of your brand, Skype. I mean, as a startup, we rely on Skype. We run our company on Skype. But of course, there was a natural concern when Microsoft took over. And whether it's imaginary or real, we do experience a few more problems than we probably did in the past. And the team automatically says, oh, it's Microsoft at work again. So how do you manage the trust of your brand in the bigger context of a bigger brand, Microsoft?
Right. I think the interesting thing there is the expectation gap. People are willing to forgive a startup if something isn't 100%. People are not willing to forgive Microsoft if something is not 100%. And so I think the expectation gap creates an issue there. We do take the Skype user quality incredibly seriously, and we pour through technical metrics on a weekly basis to make sure that the user experience is great. We pour through reputation metrics, and not every experience is actually going to be based on return speeds or latency or things that you can measure with numbers, but just in terms of qualitative things. And we do take all of that very seriously. The thing about Skype being a holistic company, or a company that cares about something beyond itself, though, is something we absolutely care about. And it's not just for the reputation benefit, but because we believe it's important. And that's through Skype in the Classroom and Peace One Day. And I think what the acquisition by Microsoft has done for Skype is to enable us to expand those programs. In fact, I challenge any other company in Silicon Valley or any other sector to put itself against Microsoft in the way it gives back to the community, and the ethos that kind of comes down from Bill and Melinda Gates with their foundation, which is not part of Microsoft, it's theirs, but then how that filters through every other dimension of Microsoft. I have never worked for a company that cares so much for the world around it, and I'm very proud to be a part of that.
Next question.
Hi, you talked about the balkanization of ideas and like people, you know, hanging together and kind of sharing their thoughts together, and it strikes me that the people in this room are partly responsible for that, because you create apps that do one specific thing that cater to a specific group of people, or a consumer product that targets a specific group. How do you deal with that issue from a societal point of view, where you are increasingly having people specialize in their ideas and specialize in their thoughts? I don't see any trends in other directions, so it means that there is very little common opportunities for conversations.
Well, I think that, and here I'm just making stuff up, right? Because I actually don't know this stuff. You're probably a much better person to answer. But I think that it means it will take effort, right? The natural course is to become more specialized and to use tools that make things easy. And what that means is that, you know, if we want to do concrete things, it means thinking about, how do I break out of that insular group that I'm a part of? And how do I go join another group? How do I understand? You talked earlier about Silicon Valley engaging in Washington. I think one mistake that we historically have made is I don't think we work as hard as we can to understand the broader issues facing the country and how the tech agenda fits into that broader set of solutions, and really be a part of a bigger conversation than what we want, what we need. As legitimate as those wants and needs are, they're not the only piece of the puzzle. And so I think, you know, whether it's local philanthropy or being part of conversations that are different, find people who disagree with you and spend time and listen 20 times more to everybody who disagrees with you than to all the people who you're like-minded with, and figure out where do you go to find those. I know, you know, it's fascinating when you get outside the valley how quickly you realize that even as close as much of San Francisco, not the tech part of San Francisco, but the rest of San Francisco, there are a lot of people there who think very differently. You know, go 30 miles east from here, and you'll probably find a lot of people who think really differently. And so find ways to put yourself in those places through some kind of activity. And if everybody did that, you know, and you'd start to create a different network that might bypass this stuff. But it doesn't mean we should stop doing the normal natural things that are causing this. It means we just should also do something to overcome it.
And I think we're early as well. I mean, I think a lot of the onus is going to fall on the big platform players, you know, and I think you can't say that Facebook or Twitter haven't done a good job of trying to create that kind of platform that people can use for whatever they want. You know, I mean, I suppose there could be more curated efforts to bring different disparate groups together, but then I think that would raise all sorts of other complicated issues. What is this? What is it? Do we want technology companies to be having that role? So it's a tricky one. But I don't think app companies, you know, how many? 200,000. They're scratching for. I was just looking at doing a story on the fact that there's not been one IPO of an app company, a pure app company. So, you know, we're not seeing app companies really scale to the point where they can have that kind of larger impact for the most part. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Steve Hoffman with HP. A lot of the examples that you've shared tonight have been very much about Silicon Valley and about the US, and I'm curious about your comments, you know, Richard, from the survey, kind of trust on a global scale, and for the rest of the panelists, given employees, customers are from all over the world, how does this loom on the global stage?
So we have a fundamentally different picture in developing countries than we do in developed. And most profoundly in China, Indonesia, India, UAE, high trust in government, but very high trust in business, high trust in chief executives, pretty high trust in leaders, but one or two important points of vulnerability. The Chinese, for example, say that they don't trust leaders to tell them the truth in a difficult circumstance. That's the Beaujolais story, as an example. That's a first kind of sign of weakness. I would also say that there's a change, there's a very different media picture in developing markets where the media that's trusted tends to be social, not mainstream, because of government ownership or control. And so, you know, Weibo is the truth in China as opposed to, you know, mainstream. So there are important differences. Also in financial services, you can move to China and be revered. No, banking is the third most trusted industry in China. Figure that. The least is food. The lowest is the food business because of the melamine scandals in China. So food has richly earned its place at the bottom in China because of problems. So there are country-specific, but generally you could say that the developing world is as the developed world was before 2000. Think about that. Before Enron and before weapons of mass destruction and before 2008 with financial weapons of mass destruction, and then the government impasses. So we are in sort of the age of the Garden of Eden, if you will, still. Except Beaujolais starts to undermine that.
Okay, I think we got time for two more questions. There's one. Oh.
So one of the things we've talked about a lot tonight is where we're at, how we got here. I'm very interested in any premonitions. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? We've got a big youth with a very different influence, with a very different perception of the world and how it's going to work. Any future telling to be told here?
I'll give you a forecast. I think we're in a long cycle of negativity for government. I think government so screwed the pooch in 2011 and 12 that it's a long recovery. I think similarly for financial services, it's a very long period of forgiveness. On the good side, I think you'll see that it's barring some catastrophe in privacy or whatever, tech will continue to be pretty strong. I think you'll see continued disparity between leaders and institutions. I don't see leaders having resilience either. So those are sort of if I had to predict for 3 years from now.
I'll add one thing on the government point, and by this I actually don't mean state and local government. But at the federal level, which is the stuff I do with, I don't even think we're at a turning point. Because when you go to Washington, it used to be that they would be embarrassed it used to be that they actually worked, right? They're in session all the time, and they would work 4 years out of 4 years. And then they would admit that last 6 months, maybe a year before the election, it was hard to get stuff done, but they were embarrassed, and they realized that was not doing their jobs. And now you go, and it was worst after the last election, so not this most recent one, but 2 years ago. I was back there, and it was like late February or March, and somebody said, oh, well, it's kind of all over because, the next election's coming. And I said, wait, you guys have been in for like 4 weeks since the last election. You're really telling me now nothing will happen for the next years? And there are too many people there who've forgotten that that's scandalous, right? That we're moving too fast as a country. We have too many problems that we need to solve. This idea that it's acceptable to say that political realities will dictate their willingness to do their jobs. And that somehow doing their jobs is about the long positioning of their party to become the dominant party, as opposed to tackling concrete things and moving forward on an issue-by-issue basis, finding areas where they do have common ground and then coming up with solutions. That's gone makes me very skeptical that we can change. And I think, to your point about youth, I think it's when people start to get engaged and hold them accountable, and not just by voting, obviously voting is a piece of it, but by becoming engaged and by making the case for what needs to be different, and to say, if you're setting your priorities, it shouldn't be this, it should be that, this is a democracy, and we all share some responsibility that we keep electing people who are not doing their job and have forgotten that they're not doing their job.
But, and I seldom try to defend politicians, but after the various decisions that have been made, if you just look at what it costs to run for every office, forget the federal offices, which are completely out of sight. I mean, I'm a dear friend of Steve Wesley because he was a student in my class many years ago, and he said, prior to Meg Whitman, I thought, leaving eBay with $200 million was enough to run for office, and now I know I better start a, venture capital company because $200 million isn't nearly enough. And if you look at what has gone on for every race, including San Francisco supervisory races, let alone Congress races, the escalation has been enormous. So what these people do, and they actually don't like it, because I know a bunch of other people who spend their time doing this, unfortunately, they have to spend all their time dialing for dollars. Right. And this, I think history will show, with all due respect to the Supreme Court, the Citizens United decision was probably one of the worst decisions in the history of this country. And now you have basically licensed corruption, through that and a bunch of other decisions which have opened up either Montana or South Dakota, one of those states, to unlimited campaign contributions. And so the anti-corruption statutes have basically been thrown out. And now it's all about, who can raise the most amount of money. So I don't think you can blame completely the politicians for spending all their time raising money when it's basically we've given them the game that they have to play, and they're now playing the game that we have given them.
No, that's a great clarification. I actually have a huge amount of respect for a lot of individual politicians, but I think we have created a system, and they give us exactly what we actually want, even though we feel betrayed by it and we reject it. And so we're all complicit in a system that's dysfunctional. It's not the people. There are many well-intentioned people on both sides of the aisle trying to do the right thing, stuck in a system that doesn't work right now.
Let's see.
I'm Marcia Dashko, and I've been consulting with organizations, executive teams for over 20 years on the topic of how to reduce fear and build trust in your organization. And one of the focus areas that we have is that fear erodes profits. And so that's kind of the short title for Fear Erodes People, Productivity, and Profits. And I'm wondering what you're seeing as far as the quote-unquote best practices and management fads and so forth in organizations that are leading to companies that are self-destructing, where they have very high turnover rates, like even a Fortune 50 company that has, turnover rate, for example, of 40%, and they don't care because they go, well, we'll just replace them. So what are you seeing when it comes to those kind of self-destructive practices and the leadership thinking that's leading to, poor profits and people losing their souls in organizations?
Well, in the aim of aiming in an upward way as opposed to that, this is my good media training. I want to turn it around and say that companies where CEOs get it, like Ford, with Alan Mulally, and he told a wonderful story. I visited him because I was trying to get his business, didn't work, oh well. But he told a great story, and I can tell it now. He said, come over here, and I said, I went over to the window, and he said, there's our competitors, and there's GM, and there's Chrysler, and let me tell you a story. My first day at Ford, which was a few weeks ago, I decided that I wanted to go see the factory floor. And he told his subordinates, and they said, oh, but Mr. Mulally, executives don't go to the factory at Ford. And he said, well, I'm going to the factory. They go, well, you can't do that. There are people there with tattoos on their arm. And he was marvelous. And he said, but I'm going because they actually buy our product. And they make our product. And actually, I can learn something from people on the floor. And, what am I learning from you guys? But he didn't say that. This sort of leadership by walking around and being one of, I think is more important than ever, actually. And this willingness to be a sponge. And this is now multiplied by X because you got to go to Indonesia and China and all sorts of other places. But you can't do your job by sitting behind your desk and counting the numbers. That's for sure. You don't lead that way. It just doesn't resonate. No one believes you. You're just a friggin' suit then.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So thank you very much.
And Peter, once again, for sharing your perspective so candidly. Really appreciate it. I think this has been a marvelous conversation. What do you think? Thank you again to Edelman for your partnership and support. A recording of this program will be available within a day or two on the Churchill Club YouTube channel. You speakers will receive the Churchill Club speaker t-shirt in the mail because they need our help. And you have been an amazing audience. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.